Judy Garland's radiant on-screen smile captivated the world. Yet behind that perfect image lay a deeply troubling reality. Many film historians argue she didn't simply succumb to Hollywood pressure. She was consumed by the studio system. Under the strict control of MGM executives, a young girl was pushed beyond human limits. What truly happened behind the glittering gates of the studio? And how did this intense environment shape her tragic fate? In September 1935, a fatherless 13-year-old named Frances Gumm walked into MGM. The studio rebranded her as Judy Garland. According to biographers, studio head Louis B. Mayer exerted immense control over her life. Reports suggest she faced harsh criticism about her appearance, often being compared unfavorably to taller blonde actresses. This relentless critique deeply affected the young star's confidence, making her entirely dependent on the studio's approval. To keep up with exhausting filming schedules, the studio intervened medically. Historical accounts reveal that instead of adequate rest, she was placed on rigorous prescription regimens. Studio doctors provided stimulants for energy and sedatives for sleep. Her physical form was equally controlled. She was placed on extreme calorie limits, with meals often consisting only of soup, cottage cheese, and black coffee. Even her joy was carefully orchestrated. During a PR stunt, the studio presented a massive birthday cake for the cameras. Judy smiled and blew out the candles. But biographers note that once the press left, the cake was taken away. She wasn't allowed a single slice. As she grew older, the demands intensified. For the filming of The Wizard of Oz, the 16-year-old was required to appear much younger. Wardrobe departments used heavy, restrictive garments to flatten her figure. The physical discomfort was immense. She worked under incredibly hot studio lights, exhausted and strictly monitored. Yet she stepped onto the soundstage, and there she sang Over the Rainbow with a smile of perfect innocence. She was treated as a tightly managed asset, molded to match the studio's blueprint. When a corporation dictates a young star's diet, rest, and energy levels, the concept of personal autonomy slowly fades away. Mayer, the architect of this prison, viewed himself as the supreme owner of the asset. This ownership manifested in the most degrading, violating manner possible. Under the thick, suffocating guise of the MGM family. Patriarch? Mayer crossed professional and personal boundaries. The stories did not surface until decades later, buried under the threat of blacklisting and the immense power of the studio publicity machine. But the reality was whispered in the corridors of the lot. Judy Garland, an insecure, fatherless teenager desperate for approval, was regularly summoned to Mayer's cavernous office. He would sit behind his massive desk, the undisputed king of Hollywood. He would talk to her about her career, about the importance of singing from the heart. Years later, she would break her silence about the reality of that cavernous office. She recounted a chilling routine where paternal vocal instructions often crossed the line into deeply inappropriate physical violation. Trapped by a man who controlled her family's livelihood and shaped her entire public existence, she endured the trauma in silence. If she screamed, she would be branded crazy and ungrateful. So she sat there in silence. She endured the touch of a man old enough to be her grandfather, swallowing the trauma just as she swallowed the amphetamines. She learned to dissociate, leaving her body behind in that office just as she did when the corset was strapped on. And the most horrifying aspect of this abuse was the absolute complicity of the adults surrounding her. The directors knew she was drugged. The wardrobe department knew she was in pain. The commissary staff knew she was starving. The studio doctors were the ones writing the prescriptions. Even her mother, Ethel Gum, the woman who was supposed to be her primary protector, was fully complicit in the machinery. Ethel was on the studio payroll. She saw the pills, she saw the exhaustion, she knew about the diets. But Ethel valued the status, the income, and the proximity to power more than she valued the physical and mental safety of her daughter. When Judy complained of being tired, Ethel did not tell Mayer to stop. Ethel told Judy to take another pill and get back on set. Judy Garland was entirely surrounded by wardens. There was no safe harbor. There was no adult in her life who viewed her as a human being first and a commodity second. The MGM lot was a closed ecosystem of exploitation, a pristine, glamorous facade built on the silent suffering of a captive child. The studio had successfully built a perfect, self-sustaining loop of destruction. They created the exhaustion, they provided the chemical cure for the exhaustion, they created the insecurity, and they provided the conditional approval to soothe the insecurity. They owned the problem and they owned the solution. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, this machinery operated at maximum efficiency. Garland's star rose to stratospheric heights. She was universally beloved. She was the girl every mother wanted for a daughter, and every boy wanted for a sweetheart. Her voice became the soundtrack of a nation trying to pull itself out of the Great Depression and bracing for a world war. She generated untold millions in revenue, expanding Mayer's empire, buying him racehorses and mansions. But inside the shell of America's sweetheart, the foundation was cracking. You cannot run a biological organism at a chemical red line indefinitely. You cannot starve a body, deprive it of sleep, and subject it to constant psychological and physical violation without a reckoning. The transition from compliant child to broken adult was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling, a desperate fight for survival inside a machine that refused to be turned off. The debt to her central nervous system was compounding daily, and the ultimate collection agency was the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer production schedule. As the 1930s closed and the 1940s began, the demand for the Judy Garland product reached a fever pitch. The studio had struck a vein of pure gold by pairing her with Mickey Rooney in a relentless series of backyard musicals. They were the undisputed king and queen of the box office. But the partnership was not an equal collaboration. It was a physical and psychological benchmark that Garland was chemically forced to meet. Rooney was a ball of manic, almost aggressive natural energy. He was older, intensely ambitious, and biologically capable of surviving the punishing hours MGM demanded. Louis B. Mayer looked at Rooney's natural hypervitality and mandated that Garland match it frame for frame. But Garland did not possess Rooney's constitution. She was an exhausted, malnourished adolescent girl. The gap between her biological reality and Rooney's frenetic pacing was bridged entirely by the studio pharmacy. The doctors increased the dosages. The original prescriptions of mild amphetamines were no longer sufficient to override her compounding exhaustion. Tolerance is a biological absolute. To keep the asset functioning at the required RPM, the fuel had to become more volatile. The medical staff escalated her to stronger doses of benzedrine to wake her up and heavy doses of Seconal and phenobarbital to shut her down. This was not a secret underground operation. It was systemic, sanctioned, and highly organized medical malpractice functioning as a standard business practice. The pills were dispensed by studio nurses. They were handed to her on the set alongside her mandated black coffee. The studio viewed these narcotics precisely the way a factory manager views lubricating oil for a conveyor belt. The machinery was squeaking. Apply the chemical grease. The long-term degradation of the parts was irrelevant, so long as the current quota was met. The physical environment of the MGM lot facilitated this complete disconnection from reality. A soundstage is a sensory deprivation tank. There are no windows. There is no natural sunlight. The massive soundproof doors seal shut, locking the outside world away. Inside, time is not measured by the sun. It is measured by the shooting schedule and the daily ledger. Garland would enter these windowless hangars before dawn, heavily sedated, and remain there until long after dark, chemically wired. Her body lost all concept of circadian rhythms. The only sun she knew was the blinding, searing heat of the Klieg lights. The only night she experienced was the sudden narcotic blackout induced by the barbiturates. She was a captive in an artificial ecosystem designed exclusively to extract performance. In this sealed environment, the camera was the ultimate instrument of torture. When the red light of the camera blinked on, Frances Gumm had to die and Judy Garland had to resurrect. The transformation was demanded instantly. Regardless of the nausea churning in her empty stomach, regardless of the chemical tremor shaking her hands, the moment the director called action, she was required to radiate pure, unadulterated joy. She learned to split herself in two. There was the girl who wept in the dressing room, begging for sleep, and there was the indestructible smiling entity that belonged to the lens. The studio only cared about the latter. They paid for the smile. They ignored the rot beneath it. But physical coercion and chemical manipulation were only the blunt instruments of her captivity. The true mastery of Louis B. Mayer lay in his psychological warfare. He was a tyrant, but he was a theatrical tyrant. He did not always manage through screaming and threats. He possessed a far more devastating weapon: emotional blackmail. Mayer was famous in Hollywood for his ability to cry on demand. He used his tears not as an expression of sorrow, but as a tactical maneuver to manipulate the vulnerable people he owned. When Garland pushed to the absolute brink of physical collapse, would finally break down and beg for a rest or plead for a lighter schedule, Mayer would not always fire back in anger. Instead, he would summon her to his vast white office. He would sit her down. He would look at her with deep, wounded eyes, and he would begin to weep. He would tell her that she was breaking his heart. He would invoke the sacred mythology of the MGM family. He would remind her of the thousands of employees, the grips, the carpenters, the secretaries, whose livelihoods supposedly depended on her finishing the picture on time. He would ask her, his voice trembling with manufactured grief, how she could be so selfish. How could she betray the studio that had saved her? How could she betray the man who loved her like a daughter? For a girl like Garland, desperate for a father figure, deeply insecure, and conditioned to believe she owed her entire existence to MGM, this tactic was devastating. The guilt was suffocating. She would leave his office in tears, apologizing for her own exhaustion, apologizing for her own biology. She would swallow her exhaustion, swallow the pills, and return to the soundstage. Mayer knew that guilt was a far cheaper and more effective restraint than a security guard. A guard can only keep you in the room. Guilt keeps you working voluntarily until you bleed. The complete ownership of her life extended far beyond the soundstage. A studio asset is not permitted to have an unscripted personal life. Adolescence is fundamentally a period of rebellion, of discovering autonomy, and of forming romantic attachments. MGM could not allow this. Autonomy was a breach of contract. Her romantic life was confiscated and managed by the publicity department. When the public demanded to see their favorite girl next door going on dates, the studio manufactured them. They paired her with approved, equally controlled young actors. The dates were highly choreographed photo opportunities, supervised by studio publicists and chaperones. They were sent to specific restaurants, told where to sit, and instructed on how to smile at each other for the flashbulbs. It was a pantomime of youth. She was performing the ritual of a first date for the cameras, while her actual human need for connection was systematically starved. When she attempted to circumvent this control and form genuine, unapproved attachments, the studio retaliated with swift, brutal efficiency. When Garland fell deeply in love with bandleader Artie Shaw, the studio panicked. Shaw was independent, intellectual, and not under the thumb of Louis B. Mayer. He was a threat to the closed ecosystem. Mayer did not just advise her against the relationship, he actively sabotaged it. The studio machinery was deployed to separate them, flooding her schedule, restricting her movements, and feeding negative information to the press. When Shaw eventually eloped with Lana Turner, another MGM property, but one whose brand was built on sex appeal rather than innocence, the betrayal shattered Garland. But the studio did not offer comfort. They offered another script and a heavier dose of Benzedrine. Her heartbreak was irrelevant. Her call time was 5 a.m. In the early 1940s, Garland married composer David Rose, a desperate attempt to build a life outside Mayer's office. But when she became pregnant, the illusion of independence was crushed. To MGM, a pregnant Judy Garland was a catastrophic liability. She was still portraying innocent teenagers. A child would cost the studio millions. The question of what she wanted was entirely irrelevant. The studio machinery simply took over, surrounded by fixers, her husband, and her own mother, all pressuring her toward a single inevitable conclusion. Judy was convinced she had no other choice. She was driven to a clinic. The procedure was performed. The child was erased from the schedule. Days later, she was returned to the soundstage, hollowed out and bleeding internally, handed a script, and ordered to sing cheerfully about the joy of young love. As the years ground on, the physical manifestations of this abuse could no longer be entirely hidden by makeup and lighting. The Judy Garland of the mid-1940s was a woman fighting a desperate, losing battle against her own chemically engineered destruction. The chronic insomnia, birthed by the amphetamines and sustained by the anxiety of her captivity, became a permanent feature of her existence. Her hands shook with a fine, uncontrollable tremor. The starvation diets left her immune system compromised, resulting in frequent illnesses that were treated with even more aggressive pharmaceutical interventions. Her weight fluctuated wildly as her thyroid and adrenal glands, battered by years of artificial stimulation and suppression, began to fail. The studio's response to her physical deterioration was not medical care. It was cosmetic concealment. When the exhaustion carved deep, dark circles under her eyes, the makeup department was ordered to apply thicker, heavier grease paint. When the lack of nutrition caused her hair to thin and fall out, she was fitted with elaborate, heavy wigs. When the chemical cocktails caused her to break out in cold sweats during a take, the wardrobe department designed costumes with built-in absorbent pads, and the director simply ordered another take. She was physically deteriorating, constantly patched, painted, and propped up by a team of corporate technicians. The makeup chair was not a place of glamour. It was simply another station on the assembly line designed to make her look vibrant for the cameras. She looked in the mirrors of her dressing room and saw a stranger. The face staring back at her was a corporate trademark, a mask created by Louis B. Mayer, sustained by a pharmacy, and beloved by a public that had no idea what it cost to maintain. The disconnect between the adored icon on the screen and the terrified, addicted, starving woman in the dressing room created a psychological chasm that could never be bridged. The machine was running too hot. The gears were stripping. The asset was rapidly depreciating. But Louis B. Mayer did not care about the longevity of the human being. He only cared about the quarterly returns. As long as she could be forced to stand upright and hit the notes, the cameras would keep rolling and the pills would keep flowing. The descent into complete physical and mental collapse was not a possibility. It was a mathematical certainty engineered by the very system that claimed to love her. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in the 1940s operated far beyond the boundaries of a standard workplace. It functioned as a sovereign state. Louis B. Mayer was its autocrat, and he operated a highly sophisticated internal surveillance network designed to monitor, control, and ultimately crush the autonomy of his most valuable assets. For Garland, there was no clocking out. There was no private life to return to when the cameras stopped rolling. Every square inch of the studio lot, every room in her house, and every interaction she had was subjected to the relentless scrutiny of the MGM intelligence apparatus. She was not just a star. She was the central node of a massive financial ecosystem, and the studio protected its investment through total paranoia. Mayer employed a shadow army of informants. They were disguised as the mundane background characters of a movie set. Wardrobe assistants, makeup artists, lighting technicians, script supervisors, and even the studio-assigned chauffeurs who drove her home. They were all on the payroll, and their secondary job description was espionage. Their mandate was simple: report every deviation from the established protocol directly to the front office. If Garland attempted to make an unapproved phone call from her dressing room, Mayer knew about it before she hung up the receiver. If she spoke for too long with a stagehand, it was logged and scrutinized for any signs of insubordination or unauthorized romantic attachment. If she showed up to set looking pale, or if her hands shook too violently to hold a prop, the studio clinic was alerted immediately to prepare the necessary chemical interventions. She was living in a panopticon. She knew she was being watched, and the psychological terror of that constant observation bred a deep, paralyzing paranoia. She could trust no one. The friendly smile of a hairdresser could be the very thing that earned her a screaming reprimand from Mayer an hour later. This surveillance extended brutally into the most fundamental human right, the right to bodily sustenance. The starvation of Judy Garland was not merely a matter of aesthetic preference. It was a mechanism of behavioral control. A starving animal is weak. A starving human being lacks the physical and cognitive energy required to mount a rebellion. By keeping her in a state of perpetual caloric deficit, the studio ensured she remained physically fragile and highly compliant. The enforcement of the chicken soup and cottage cheese diet was militant. The studio commissary was the primary enforcement zone, but the control reached far beyond those walls. If Garland attended an industry dinner or a promotional banquet, an MGM handler sat next to her. Their job was not to fetch her drinks. Their job was to physically intervene if she attempted to eat the food placed in front of her. Sitting at a table surrounded by your peers, adults eating steak and potatoes, while a corporate minder slaps your hand away from a bread roll, was a profound humiliation. She was a millionaire who could not buy a sandwich. She was an international icon who had to beg a studio publicist for permission to swallow a piece of chocolate. The hunger was a constant gnawing physical pain, a deliberate baseline of suffering that she was expected to endure silently. When the hunger became too agonizing, causing her to double over in cramps between takes, the studio did not offer food, they offered cigarettes. The wardrobe department was instructed to ensure her costumes always had a hidden pocket for her mandated packs of Pall Malls. Nicotine was prescribed as a dietary supplement. She was expected to chain smoke to kill her appetite, filling her lungs with tar to keep her waistline acceptable to the MGM ledger. This systematic denial of her biological needs stripped her of all human dignity. It reinforced the daily reality that her flesh did not belong to her. It was leased to the studio, and the studio would maintain the property exactly as it saw fit. The dressing room, traditionally a sanctuary for an actor to prepare and decompress, was repurposed by MGM into a holding cell. For Garland, there were no locks on the doors. She was not permitted the luxury of privacy. The space was constantly violated by studio personnel. Executives would walk in unannounced to check on her weight. Doctors would enter with their black bags to administer the mandatory injections of vitamins and amphetamines. Wardrobe mistresses would enter to strap her into the restrictive undergarments that literally bound her flesh. The corsets she was forced to wear were instruments of physical denial. As she moved through her late teens and into her early 20s, her body naturally sought to mature. It sought to expand, to develop the curves of a grown woman. MGM viewed this natural biological progression as an active threat to the Girl Next Door franchise that was generating millions in revenue. They could not stop time, but they could bind it. The canvas corsets were engineered to compress her rib cage and flatten her breasts. They were laced so tightly that they left deep purple contusions across her torso. The physical restriction made it difficult to draw a full breath, a particularly cruel irony for a woman whose entire value was predicated on her ability to sing. She had to learn how to project that massive booming voice while her lungs were being mechanically crushed by her own employer. She wore these bindings for up to 18 hours a day. In the stifling heat of the unair-conditioned sound stages, the heavy canvas would soak with sweat, chafing her raw skin, creating open sores that had to be heavily powdered and bandaged before the next day of shooting. The pain was excruciating, a constant sharp reminder of her captivity, but she could not complain. To complain was to be difficult. To complain was to risk the wrath of Louis B. Mayer and the suspension of her contract, which meant the suspension of the income her entire family relied upon. Her own mother, Ethel, offered no protection. When Judy cried from exhaustion or fear, Ethel, who was on the studio payroll, simply told her to dry her tears, fix her makeup, and get back to work. The paycheck was more important than the pain. As the 1940s progressed, the relentless diet of amphetamines, barbiturates, and starvation began to tear her apart. Judy developed a violent, visible shake in her hands. She suffered from crippling migraines and chronic infections. But MGM did not recognize illness. They recognized insubordination. When her body physically refused to stand up, when the migraines forced her to the floor of her dressing room in agony, the studio did not call for an ambulance. They called the legal department. They viewed her physical collapse not as a medical emergency, but as a breach of contract. This is where the narrative of Judy Garland, the difficult star, was born. It was a narrative deliberately manufactured and aggressively peddled by the MGM publicity department to cover up their own systemic malpractice. When Garland was physically incapable of coming to the set because she was having a nervous breakdown induced by the studio's own pharmaceutical interventions, the studio leaked stories to the press. They planted rumors in the gossip columns. They painted her as a spoiled, temperamental diva who was holding up production because of petty whims. They told the public she was ungrateful. They told the industry she was unreliable. They shifted the blame for her deterioration entirely onto her shoulders. The cruelty of this tactic was absolute. They broke her legs and then publicly berated her for limping. They punished her financially. For every day she missed due to illness or exhaustion, MGM suspended her without pay. They added the lost time to the end of her 7-year contract, effectively extending her prison sentence every time her body failed. They docked her salary to cover the costs of idle crews and delayed production schedules. They weaponized her own physical collapse to drive her deeper into debt and dependency. The psychological toll of this public humiliation was the final nail in the coffin of her self-worth. She was reading stories in the newspaper calling her a monster, knowing that the people writing the stories were the same people handing her the pills. She was trapped in an abusive relationship with a multi-billion-dollar corporation that had the power to rewrite history in real time. When she did manage to drag herself onto the set, heavily medicated and terrified of further punishment, the environment was hostile. The directors, under immense pressure from Mayer to make up for lost time, showed no mercy. If she missed a mark, if she forgot a line because her brain was clouded by barbiturate hangovers, they screamed at her in front of the entire crew. They humiliated her publicly, reinforcing Mayer's original conditioning. She was stupid, she was worthless, she was only valuable if she performed perfectly. During the filming of Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944, the contrast between the product and the reality reached a grotesque extreme. The film is a masterpiece of cinematic nostalgia, a warm, glowing portrait of idealized American family life at the turn of the century. Garland plays Esther Smith, a picture of radiant, untroubled youth. The reality behind the camera was a horror show. Garland was 21 years old, but her internal organs were aging at an accelerated rate. She was heavily addicted to the studio-supplied narcotics. Her marriage to David Rose was collapsing. She was deeply depressed, isolated, and physically deteriorating. The director of the film, Vincente Minnelli, was a perfectionist who demanded countless takes. Garland, running on fumes and amphetamines, was pushed to the absolute limit of her endurance. In the famous scene where she sings, "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," the heartbreak in her voice is not acting. It is the sound of a woman who is drowning in plain sight. She is singing a song about holding on to hope while standing in the middle of a corporate machine that had already stripped her of everything she owned. MGM did not care about the heartbreak. They only cared that it recorded well on the audio track. They captured her genuine raw agony, packaged it in Technicolor, and sold it to the masses. The film was a massive historic success. It solidified her status as a legendary icon. It generated millions of dollars for Louis B. Mayer, and it pushed Judy Garland one step closer to the abyss. The system had perfected the art of extraction. They had learned exactly how to siphon the soul out of a human being and print it onto celluloid. But the reservoir was running dry. The chemicals were losing their effectiveness. The fear was losing its grip as her mind began to seek the ultimate escape from the torture. The machine was breaking down, and Louis B. Mayer, sitting in his white office, began to calculate the exact moment it would be more profitable to scrap the parts than to continue the repairs. The illusion of escape is the most cruel mechanism of any prison. In 1945, Judy Garland believed she had found a way out. She divorced David Rose and married Vincente Minnelli, the director of Meet Me in St. Louis. To the public, it was the ultimate Hollywood romance. The brilliant auteur and his beautiful, talented leading lady uniting in matrimony. The magazines printed photos of their wedding. The narrative was perfect, but the reality was a seamless transfer of ownership. Garland did not escape the factory. She simply married the foreman. Vincente Minnelli was an MGM employee. His primary loyalty was to the lens, to the aesthetic perfection of the frame, and ultimately to Louis B. Mayer. He was a notoriously obsessive director who demanded absolute visual and emotional precision from his actors. He did not view Garland as a fragile, traumatized wife in need of sanctuary. He viewed her as his ultimate cinematic instrument. He brought the unrelenting pressure of the soundstage directly into her bedroom. There was no longer any physical or psychological boundary between her marriage and her employment. The corporation had successfully infiltrated her home. When Garland became pregnant in 1945 with her daughter Liza, the biological reality of carrying a child collided violently with the chemical reality of her existence. For a decade, her body had been sustained exclusively by amphetamines and barbiturates. Suddenly, she was forced to detoxify. She had to strip the synthetic stimulants from her blood to protect the fetus. The withdrawal was catastrophic. Without the pills, her nervous system crashed. The suppressed exhaustion of 10 years of forced labor hit her simultaneously. She was bedridden, suffering from severe depression, violent mood swings, and crippling physical pain. Her body was screaming for the chemicals it needed to function. MGM viewed this pregnancy not as a miracle, but as a severe logistical failure. It was a breach of production schedules. They tolerated the 9 months of downtime because they had no choice. But the moment Liza was born in 1946, the grace period was terminated. Garland was hit with profound, debilitating postpartum depression. Her mind, already fractured by years of abuse, sank into a dark, paralyzing void. She could not get out of bed. She could not stop crying. She was a woman in a severe medical crisis. The studio did not recognize postpartum depression. The MGM accounting department did not have a billing code for maternal trauma. They had release dates to meet. Louis B. Mayer looked at the reports of her weeping in her home and saw only idle capital. The solution was standard operating procedure. The studio doctors were dispatched to the Minnelli residence. They opened their black bags. They reintroduced the amphetamines. They chemically wired a severely depressed postpartum mother, forced her out of her house, and pushed her back onto the sound stage. The result was the catastrophic production of The Pirate in 1947. Directed by her husband, the film became the site of Garland's total psychological disintegration. The amphetamines, which had once given her the manic energy to dance alongside Mickey Rooney, now turned against her. Her central nervous system was so degraded that the stimulants triggered severe, acute psychosis. She developed intense paranoia. She believed the crew was whispering about her. She believed the cameras were weapons designed to steal her soul. The sound of the clapperboard snapping shut caused her to flinch as if she had been struck. She would lock herself in her dressing room, weeping hysterically, refusing to come out for hours, sometimes days. Vincente Minnelli did not stop production. He did not protect his wife. He stood on the set, flanked by studio executives, and waited for her to be chemically propped up so he could get his shot. He demanded endless retakes, pushing a hallucinating, terrified woman to execute complex musical numbers. The marriage was entirely subordinate to the shooting schedule. Garland missed 99 days of shooting on The Pirate. For Louis B. Mayer, this was not a human tragedy. It was a financial hemorrhage. Every day she remained locked in her dressing room. The production went over budget. Crews were paid to stand around. Equipment rentals accumulated. The ledger bled red. Mayer did not respond with empathy. He responded with the brutal, punitive logic of a debt collector. MGM weaponized her illness. They docked her pay. They charged her personally for the production delays. For every day she was physically or mentally incapable of working due to the precise chemical addiction the studio had engineered, they subtracted thousands of dollars from her salary. They were charging the prisoner for the cost of maintaining the prison. The financial pressure compounded the psychological terror. She was losing her mind, and she was going bankrupt in the process. In 1947, the machine broke down completely. Garland made her first documented suicide attempt. She cut her wrist with a broken glass. It was a desperate, bloody plea for release. It was the only way she knew how to make the camera stop rolling. But the studio machinery moved faster than her despair. The MGM fixers arrived. They covered up the incident. They controlled the press. They planted stories about minor accidents and nervous exhaustion. The public narrative remained pristine, but the asset was fundamentally damaged. A bleeding wrist cannot sing. Mayer realized that standard pharmaceutical maintenance was no longer sufficient. The machine required a hard reboot. She was sent to private psychiatric sanitariums and subjected to electroconvulsive therapy. While this was a standard medical treatment for severe depression in that era, the sheer brutality of the unmitigated electrical currents acted less as a cure and more as a violent system reboot. MGM financed the procedures to stabilize their star for the soundstage. The shock severely impaired her memory and cognitive functions. Yet the core trauma, the bone-deep terror of the studio, remained entirely untouched. The moment she was deemed stable, meaning the moment she could walk and speak without collapsing, she was yanked out of the sanitarium. There was no recovery period. The studio had a picture waiting. They threw her directly into the production of Easter Parade in 1948. The sheer terror was unadulterated. She was fresh off an electroshock table. Her brain was scrambled. Her memory was failing. Her body was still fiercely addicted to barbiturates, and she was shoved under the searing Klieg lights alongside Fred Astaire, expected to deliver a flawless, high-energy, comedic performance. This is the ultimate tragic paradox of Judy Garland. Her raw, innate talent was her worst enemy. It was a curse. Despite the electroshock, despite the pills, despite the starvation and the profound psychiatric damage, when the director yelled, "Action!" the genius took over. She performed brilliantly. She sang with unmatched power. She danced flawlessly. She masked her own execution so perfectly that the audience never suspected a thing. Easter Parade was a massive critical and commercial smash. It was the highest grossing film of her career up to that point. It broke box office records. For Louis B. Mayer, the massive financial return of Easter Parade was total validation. The numbers on the ledger proved his methods were correct. The abuse worked. The starvation worked. The electroshock worked. The machine had been repaired, and it was printing money faster than ever before. Any lingering moral hesitation, if such a concept even existed within the MGM executive suite, was instantly eradicated by the box office receipts. Because the reboot was deemed a success, the studio immediately accelerated the assembly line. There was no rest. There was no mercy. They scheduled her for back-to-back productions, The Barclays of Broadway, In the Good Old Summertime, and Annie Get Your Gun. They intended to work her until the gears melted. During the pre-production of The Barclays of Broadway, her body finally initiated a total biological strike. The amphetamines no longer provided energy. They only provided panic. The barbiturates no longer provided sleep. They only provided comas. She could not learn the choreography. She could not remember her lines. The electroshock had damaged her cognitive retention. She would stand on the rehearsal stage, staring blankly at the director, tears streaming down her face, her mind entirely empty. MGM did not hesitate. They fired her from the picture and replaced her with Ginger Rogers. The message was explicit. You are entirely replaceable, but they still owned her contract. They forced her into In the Good Old Summertime. By this point, her physical appearance was shocking. She was skeletal. Her eyes were hollow and vacant. The wardrobe department had to construct heavily padded costumes to hide her emaciated frame from the camera. The makeup artist spent hours painting a thick synthetic mask of health over her gray, dying skin. She was sleepwalking through the production, a heavily medicated ghost haunting her own movie. Then came the final brutal execution, Annie Get Your Gun, in 1949. The role of Annie Oakley demanded aggressive, boundless physical energy. It was a role completely unsuited for a woman dying of corporate-sponsored pharmaceutical poisoning. Garland showed up to the set. She tried. She swallowed the pills. She put on the costume. But the machine was dead. She could not hit the marks. Her voice, once the most powerful instrument in Hollywood, was a ragged, weak rasp. Her hair was falling out in clumps due to malnutrition and stress. She was suffering from daily violent panic attacks, locking herself in her dressing room and screaming in terror. Louis B. Mayer did not weep this time. He did not call her to his office and play the wounded patriarch. The ledger was clear. The asset was fully depreciated. The maintenance costs, the delays, the doctors, the sanitariums now exceeded the projected box office returns. Mayer looked at the numbers. He made a purely mathematical decision. On June 17, 1949, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer officially suspended Judy Garland. They cut off her salary. They barred her from the lot. They stripped her of her security clearance to the only home she had known since she was 13 years old. They did not offer a pension. They did not offer medical care. They did not offer a severance package. They simply detached the hose, opened the factory door, and threw the broken machinery out into the street. Louis B. Mayer had taken a vibrant, trusting 13-year-old girl. He had systematically starved her, drugged her, humiliated her, isolated her, and subjected her to electroshock therapy. He had extracted millions of dollars from her vocal cords. And when she was 27 years old, a shattered, addicted, suicidal woman who no longer resembled the girl in the ruby slippers, he threw her away like industrial waste. The system had functioned flawlessly. The suspension of 1949 did not hold. In September 1950, after 15 years of generating unquantifiable wealth, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer formally and permanently severed its contract with Judy Garland. The public narrative, carefully curated by the studio's publicity department, was one of mutual parting. The press releases spoke of exhaustion and the need for rest. They painted MGM as a patient employer that had finally exhausted all options trying to help a troubled star. The industry trades whispered that she was unemployable, a liability, a washed-up diva who had thrown away the greatest opportunity in Hollywood. The reality was a corporate eviction. They did not just fire an employee, they dismantled a life support system. Since the age of 13, Judy Garland had existed entirely within the heavily guarded, artificially sustained terrarium of the MGM lot. The studio had paid her bills. The studio had managed her taxes. The studio had dictated her wardrobe, her diet, and her relationships. Most importantly, the studio had regulated her central nervous system. When the iron gates of Culver City closed behind her, she was 28 years old, and she possessed none of the basic survival skills required of an adult human being. She was an institutionalized child, violently expelled into a reality she had never been permitted to learn. She faced a world without the studio's rigid, life-sustaining architecture, completely unequipped for independence. MGM had severed the legal contract, but they could not sever the biological contract they had written in her blood. The studio doctors locked their black bags and returned to the clinic to medicate the next generation of child stars. But Garland's cellular demand for amphetamines and barbiturates did not stop. Her body still operated on the catastrophic chemical pendulum the studio had engineered. She needed the uppers to generate the energy to stand up. She needed the downers to silence the screaming panic in her head. Without the corporate pharmacy, she was forced into the shadows. The legitimate studio-sanctioned medical care was replaced by a desperate, unregulated scramble for narcotics. She had to find private doctors willing to write excessive prescriptions for a fee. She had to navigate the black market. The beloved girl next door was reduced to begging for chemical equilibrium, terrified of the agonizing physical withdrawal that awaited her if the supply chain broke. The psychological architecture Louis B. Mayer had built inside her mind also remained entirely intact. Mayer was physically absent, but his voice was a permanent resident in her head. She looked in the mirror and still saw the little pig. She still saw the hunchback. She still believed she was profoundly ugly, entirely unlovable, and completely worthless without the validation of an audience. Mayer had installed a self-destruct mechanism, and in 1950, he handed her the detonator. In June of that year, just before the final termination of her contract, Garland was informed that she was being replaced by Jane Powell in the film Royal Wedding. It was another public humiliation, another confirmation that she was defective. She walked into the bathroom of her home in Beverly Hills. She locked the door, she took a shattered glass, and she slashed her own throat. It was a violent, desperate attempt to sever the vocal cords that had enslaved her, to bleed out the trauma on the bathroom tiles. She wanted to silence the voice that everyone else owned. She survived. Her husband, Vincente Minnelli, broke down the door. The paramedics arrived, but the response from the Hollywood establishment was not compassion, it was revulsion. The industry viewed suicide not as a medical crisis, but as a public relations disaster. The studio fixers, even though she was on the verge of termination, scrambled to minimize the damage. They lied to the press. They claimed she had simply scratched herself. They trivialized her agony to protect the brand. When she was discharged from the hospital, she was physically scarred and financially ruined. She was millions of dollars in debt. The massive salaries she had earned at MGM had evaporated, siphoned off by managers, agents, her mother, and the exorbitant taxes she had never been taught to manage. The IRS was circling. She had no income. She had a young daughter, Liza, and a collapsing marriage to Minnelli. She was standing on the edge of total annihilation. The Hollywood studio system had declared her dead. The movie roles vanished. The executives who had once kissed her hand at banquets now refused to take her phone calls. She was radioactive. The men who built the machine colluded to ensure she would never work in their town again. Exiled from the screen, Garland was forced onto the grueling, unregulated live concert circuit just to survive. But the concert stage was simply a new, mobile prison. To endure the physical grind of touring, her chemical intake escalated. Amphetamines to wake up, alcohol and barbiturates to numb the panic attacks before shows. She was working herself to the bone just to appease the IRS and her mounting creditors. Desperate to conquer the medium that had expelled her, she secured a deal with Warner Brothers in 1953. In 1954, the project was A Star is Born, the psychological trigger of returning to a major movie studio, resurrected the ghost of Louis B. Mayer. Her PTSD was overwhelming. She self-medicated aggressively, locking herself in her dressing room, paralyzed by anxiety and severe barbiturate hangovers. The budget exploded and executives panicked. But when she finally stepped onto the set, she delivered a performance of such raw, bleeding intensity that it frightened the crew. Her performance was not merely acting, it was a raw, unfiltered display of her own lived trauma. The emotional climax of the film, where her character accepts an Academy Award while her drunk, humiliated husband interrupts her speech, was a mirror reflecting her own profound insecurities. She was channeling the terror of being publicly humiliated, the terror of losing everything, the terror of not being enough. A Star is Born was released in the fall of 1954. It was hailed as a masterpiece. Critics called it the greatest performance of her career. The comeback was complete. The industry that had discarded her was forced to bow to her undeniable genius. She was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actress. The narrative was perfect, the ultimate redemption story. The girl discarded by MGM, rising from the ashes to claim the industry's highest honor. On the night of the Academy Awards in March 1955, Garland could not attend the ceremony. She had just given birth to her third child, Joey, and was recovering in a hospital room. NBC, anticipating her victory, dispatched a massive camera crew to her hospital suite. They set up lights, ran cables down the hallways, and positioned a live television feed at the foot of her bed. They were prepared to broadcast her triumphant acceptance speech to the world. She sat up in bed, wearing a silk bed jacket, heavily made up, surrounded by doctors, nurses, and network executives. She waited for the envelope to be opened. She waited for the validation she had been chasing since she was 13 years old. She waited for the industry to formally apologize for what they had done to her. The presenter opened the envelope. The winner was Grace Kelly for The Country Girl. The silence in the hospital room was absolute. The NBC camera crew, without a word, immediately began tearing down the equipment. They pulled the cables. They packed the lights. They left her sitting in the bed, watching them dismantle the machinery of her brief, illusory triumph. It was a cold, brutal, and entirely appropriate metaphor for her entire life in show business. The industry set up the lights, demanded her performance, extracted the value, and the moment she was no longer the winner, they pulled the plug and walked away in the dark. Grace Kelly was the epitome of the cool, blonde, flawless perfection that Louis B. Mayer had always preferred over Garland. The Academy chose the pristine, untroubled image over the scarred, bleeding reality. The loss of the Oscar was not just a disappointment. It confirmed the darkest whisper Mayer had planted in her brain: "You will never be good enough." Her movie career was definitively over. There would be no more sweeping cinematic comebacks. The studios had learned their lesson. Her talent was undeniable, but the insurance companies refused to bond her. She was exiled back to the endless purgatory of the concert circuit. The physical damage inflicted by the MGM years now manifested into chronic, life-threatening illnesses. Her liver, tasked with processing lethal amounts of prescription chemicals for 2 decades, began to fail. The doctors told her she had at most 5 years to live. But the machine would not let her die in peace. The IRS agents literally showed up at her hospital room door. They seized her house and emptied her bank accounts. She owed hundreds of thousands of dollars. By the late 1960s, the eviction from the Hollywood elite was complete. The woman who had generated hundreds of millions for MGM was now homeless, bouncing between cheap hotels and reduced to singing in dingy nightclubs just to pay for a night's sleep. The physical pain was constant. Her mind was a battlefield of paranoia. The ghost of Louis B. Mayer never left her. The gaslighting was so deeply wired into her neural pathways that she still believed she was ugly and worthless. In 1968, she found her final warden, Mickey Deans, a nightclub manager who initially entered her life by delivering a package of barbiturates to her hotel. He recognized the residual value of the dying asset and booked her for a brutal 5-week residency at a cabaret in London. She was 46 years old, weighing less than 100 pounds, performing to hostile crowds just to pay the pharmacy bills. She absorbed the humiliation just as she had absorbed the physical violations in Louis B. Mayer's office. She had been trained to endure the unendurable. A week earlier in London, she had married Mickey Deans at the Chelsea Register office. The wedding was a spectacle of profound isolation. She had invited hundreds of people, celebrities, old friends, former colleagues from the golden age of Hollywood. She rented out a lavish nightclub for the reception. She wanted to prove to the world and perhaps to herself that she was still loved, that she was still part of the establishment. Nobody came. The reception hall was virtually empty. The Hollywood elite, the people who had built their own careers standing next to her on sound stages, the executives who had profited from her destruction, stayed away. They had washed their hands of her. She was a bad memory, a liability, a depressing reminder of the human cost of their industry. She stood in the empty nightclub, wearing her wedding dress, surrounded by a handful of minor acquaintances and the predatory man she had just married. It was the ultimate crushing realization of her abandonment. The MGM family was a myth. The unconditional love of the audience was a transaction. When she stopped being profitable, she stopped being a person to them. She returned to the small rented Mews house in Chelsea with Mickey Deans. The spring of 1969 was a period of rapid, terrifying physical failure. Her liver was shutting down, making her chronically nauseous and weak. The insomnia was absolute. She would wander the small house at all hours of the night, terrified of the dark, terrified of her own thoughts. She would make frantic, erratic phone calls to friends in the United States, begging them to send money, begging them to tell her she was a good singer, begging for validation. She was 46 years old, but her cellular age was that of an elderly woman at the end of a long, terminal illness. The autopsy would later reveal the extent of the internal devastation, but the outward signs were undeniable. The life force was draining out of her. Mickey Deans continued to seek out business opportunities. He tried to book her into a chain of cinemas. He discussed a potential film role that would never materialize. He was still trying to extract value from a mine that had been completely tapped out decades ago by Louis B. Mayer. The tragedy of her final weeks in London is the tragedy of inescapable conditioning. She had been taught since she was 13 years old that her only value on earth was her ability to work. She did not know how to rest. She did not believe she deserved to rest unless she had performed. So, even as her organs failed, she continued to plan for the next show. She continued to memorize lyrics. She continued to worry about her weight. Louis B. Mayer was long buried in a cemetery in Los Angeles, but his ghost walked the halls of the Chelsea apartment every night. He was the voice in the mirror telling her to take another amphetamine so she wouldn't look tired. He was the whisper in the dark, telling her to take another barbiturate so she could sleep before the call time. He had built a psychological prison so perfect, so impenetrable, that it did not require walls or guards or iron bars. It only required the victim to believe that the prison was her entire world. The system that began in a massive white executive office in Culver City in 1935 had reached its logical, inevitable conclusion in a small bathroom in London in 1969. The corporation had installed the hardware, written the software, and set the parameters of destruction. They had handed her the pills, taught her the self-hatred, and extracted the wealth. They had wound the toy as tightly as the springs would allow, and now, 3 decades later, the mechanism was finally, irreparably snapping apart. 30 years of artificial acceleration had exacted a devastating toll. By June of 1969, living in a small rented mews house in Cadogan Lane, Belgravia, London, Judy Garland was entirely bankrupt, both financially and physically. It was a modest, unremarkable property, a universe away from the sprawling, heavily guarded estates of Holmby Hills or the pristine white offices of Culver City. The woman who occupied it was 47 years old. But a chronological age is a useless metric for a human being who has been subjected to accelerated artificial aging since puberty. Her internal organs were a battleground of scar tissue and pharmaceutical residue. The liver, tasked with filtering the endless daily barrage of amphetamines, barbiturates, and alcohol, was hardened and failing. The heart, which had been artificially accelerated to a frantic, manic rhythm by benzodrine and dexedrine for decades, was weak and irregular. Her central nervous system, the delicate electrical grid that governs human cognition and emotional regulation, was permanently short-circuited. She was suffering from severe chronic malnutrition. Her digestive system, trained by Louis B. Mayer to accept only black coffee and chicken soup, could rarely process solid food without violent physical rejection. She weighed less than 90 pounds. Her skin was a translucent, bruised parchment. The most terrifying aspect of her final weeks was the complete normalization of this chaos. The extreme chemical dependency was not a secret, clandestine activity. It was the fundamental operating system of her daily life. Mickey Deans, her 5th husband and final manager, functioned as the ultimate enabler in a long lineage of men who controlled her supply. Her survival depended entirely on Seconal, a powerful barbiturate. Decades of escalating tolerance born in the MGM clinic had pushed her required dosage to a terrifying threshold. She took the pills to quiet the racing, anxious thoughts, but the brainstem, the center of automatic breathing, could not withstand the chemical flood. In the early hours of June 22, 1969, isolated in her London bathroom, she sought silence from the enduring terror in her mind. The heavy sedation finally overpowered her anxiety. Her respiratory system simply powered down. It was a quiet, clinical failure of a biological machine pushed far beyond its limits. Following her death, the industry that systematically broke her attended her funeral in mourning. They carefully omitted their role in her demise. While her estate was left utterly bankrupt, MGM coldly liquidated its own past, auctioning off her iconic ruby slippers to settle corporate debts. Today, the pristine image of Dorothy Gale remains immortal, but it stands on the tragedy of Frances Gumm, a haunting reminder of a golden age built on captive souls.